The USS Abraham Lincoln cut through the Arabian Sea like a steel fortress, its deck alive with the controlled chaos that defined carrier operations. March 2019, the sun beat down mercilessly as sailors in colored jerseys darted across the non-skid surface, each movement precise, each gesture critical. Yellow shirts guided aircraft with practiced hand signals, while purple shirts fueled jets that screamed to life with ear-splitting roars. In the midst of this choreographed storm stood a man they called Old-Timer, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tennant, age 47, moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd seen too many things go wrong too fast. His weathered face carried lines that mapped out decades of salt spray and hard decisions. The younger sailors, most barely into their 20s, would exchange glances when he passed. There were whispers in the berthing spaces after lights out. Why was someone his age still working the deck? Most chiefs his rank had moved to administrative roles, pushing papers in air-conditioned spaces below deck. But here was Tennant, day after day checking tie-down chains, inspecting safety equipment, moving like his joints ached but never complaining. To the fresh-faced airman straight out of boot camp, he seemed out of place, a relic from another era who couldn't let go. Lieutenant Josh Carver, the air boss's assistant, watched Tennant from the tower that morning and shook his head. The old chief was on his hands and knees inspecting a steam catapult track, running his fingers along the metal with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Carver had tried to reassign him twice already, suggesting easier duty stations, but Tennant had refused every time. The flight schedule was packed that day with training exercises, Super Hornets launching every 12 minutes in a rhythm that demanded absolute precision. One mistake, one moment of inattention, and someone could die. The deck of an aircraft carrier was the most dangerous workplace on Earth, a fact written in blood across decades of naval history. Jet engines generated enough thrust to throw a man overboard. Spinning propellers could turn a human body into meat in seconds. Arresting cables, when they snapped, whipped across the deck with lethal force. This was no place for someone whose reflexes had slowed, whose hearing had dulled from years of exposure to screaming turbines. At least, that's what everyone thought about Old-Timer. The morning brief in the ready room was standard procedure, but tensions ran higher than usual. Commander Sarah Vickers, the Air Wing commander, stood before a room packed with aviators and deck crew, her eyes scanning faces that ranged from eager to exhausted. She clicked through slides showing the day's flight operations, weather conditions, and safety protocols that everyone had heard 1,000 times before. But something was different today. Intelligence reports had flagged unusual activity in the region, increased radio chatter from non-state actors, small craft movements that didn't match commercial patterns, nothing concrete, nothing that would cancel operations, but enough to put everyone on edge. Marcus Tennant sat in the back row, his hands folded on the table in front of him, absorbing every word. While younger sailors fidgeted with their phones or whispered to each other, Tennant remained absolutely still, his eyes tracking every detail on the screen. Carver noticed this, noticed how the old chief's posture had changed from the shuffling deck worker to something else entirely, something coiled and alert. After the brief, as sailors filed out toward their stations, Carver caught up with Tennant in the passageway. The corridor was narrow, forcing them to step aside every few seconds as personnel rushed past in both directions. "Chief, I need to talk to you about your assignment," Carver said, trying to sound casual but firm. Tennant turned slowly, meeting the lieutenant's eyes with a gaze that made Carver suddenly uncomfortable. There was something in those eyes that didn't match the bent-over old man he'd seen on deck. "What about it, sir?" Tennant's voice was quiet, controlled. "Look, no offense, but maybe it's time to consider a transfer. Maintenance division could use someone with your experience, climate-controlled workspace, regular hours, less physical strain." Carver watched for a reaction, expecting relief, or maybe wounded pride. Instead, Tennant just smiled slightly, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Lieutenant, but I'm exactly where I need to be." Before Carver could press further, the 1MC speaker crackled to life with the call for flight quarters. Tennant turned and moved toward the ladder, and Carver could have sworn the limp he'd noticed before had completely disappeared. By midday, the flight deck was operating at full tempo, a ballet of controlled violence that never ceased to amaze even the most jaded observers. FA-18 Super Hornets were launching and recovering in perfect sequence, each catapult shot sending 60,000 pounds of aircraft from 0 to 165 miles per hour in 2 seconds. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against your chest even through double hearing protection. Marcus Tennant worked his station near Catapult 3, checking the bridle attachments and shuttle tensions with methodical precision. Airman Kyle Rossiter, 20 years old and 3 months into his first deployment, worked nearby and couldn't help watching the old chief. Rossiter had grown up playing video games about carrier operations, thought he knew what to expect, but the reality had been overwhelming. In his first week, he'd frozen during a deck emergency, nearly getting himself killed when he stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Tennant had grabbed him by his float coat and yanked him aside just as a taxiing Hornet passed within feet of where he'd been standing. Since then, Rossiter had noticed that Tennant always seemed to be in the right place at the right moment, always aware of everything happening around him in a way that defied explanation. Now, watching the chief work, Rossiter saw how Tennant's eyes never stopped moving, tracking every aircraft, every piece of equipment, every person on deck with an intensity that seemed superhuman. A yellow shirt waved off a Hornet for launch, and Tennant suddenly straightened, his head cocking slightly to one side like he'd heard something. Rossiter looked around but saw nothing unusual, just the normal chaos of flight ops. But Tennant was already moving, walking quickly toward the island's superstructure with purpose that made Rossiter's stomach clench. Something was wrong. Tennant keyed his radio, speaking words that Rossiter couldn't hear over the engine noise, but he saw the old chief's face, and it wasn't the face of a worn-out petty officer anymore. It was the face of someone who'd seen combat, someone who'd made life-and-death decisions in seconds and lived with the consequences. 2 decks below, in the carrier's combat information center, radar operators were tracking a contact that had appeared suddenly on their screens. The contact was moving fast, too fast for a commercial vessel, and it was heading directly toward the carrier strike group. Lieutenant Commander James Park, the tactical action officer on watch, leaned over the radar display, his jaw tight. Standard procedure required them to vector an aircraft to investigate, but with flight ops in full swing, pulling a jet off the schedule would create complications. He was still weighing options when his radio crackled with a transmission from the flight deck. "TAO, this is Chief Tennant, Catapult Division. I have a visual on a fast-moving contact bearing 270, range approximately 12 miles. Small craft, possibly multiple, requesting immediate CAP vector." Park's eyes widened. How the hell could someone on deck see anything at 12 miles? The radar contact was there, but visual confirmation from the deck should have been impossible in these conditions. He grabbed his radio. "Chief Tennant, say again your last. How are you getting visual at that range?" There was a pause, and when Tennant responded, his voice had changed entirely, shedding the old-timer drawl for something crisp and authoritative. "TAO, I've been tracking them with binoculars for the past 6 minutes. These aren't fishing boats. They're moving in a tactical spread pattern using commercial traffic as concealment, and they're armed. I can see mounted weapons on at least 2 vessels. This is a coordinated approach, and we need to respond now." The Combat Information Center went silent. Every operator turned to look at Park, waiting for his call. Armed vessels approaching in formation meant one thing: a potential terrorist attack using small boats, the same tactic that had nearly sunk the USS Cole in 2000. Park made his decision in seconds. "Sound General Quarters. Launch the ready cap immediately. Get the Seahawk airborne for maritime interdiction. Notify the strike group commander." Alarm klaxons began wailing throughout the ship as thousands of sailors rushed to battle stations. On the flight deck, the chaos intensified as the carrier pivoted from training operations to real-world defense. Marcus Tennant was already moving, but not toward shelter like most non-essential personnel. He was heading toward the starboard catwalk, toward the small craft that were closing the distance faster than anyone had calculated. Airman Rossiter, now at his general quarters station, watched in confusion as the old chief climbed through a hatch that should have been secured. Where the hell was he going? The next 15 minutes unfolded with the terrifying speed of combat operations. 2 FA-18s screamed off the catapults and banked hard toward the approaching contacts, their pilots already locked onto the targets that were now visible on infrared. The Seahawk helicopter lifted off with a security team aboard, but everyone in the Combat Information Center knew the timing was going to be tight. The small boats were inside 8 miles now, and at their current speed they could reach weapons range in under 10 minutes. Commander Vickers burst into the CIC, her face a mask of controlled intensity. "Status report now." Park updated her rapidly, his words clipped and efficient. 6 confirmed hostile contacts, possible suicide boats with explosive payloads. CAP is inbound, ETA 3 minutes, Seahawk airborne but won't make intercept in time. The carrier's phalanx close-in weapon systems, basically Gatling guns that could fire 4,500 rounds per minute, swiveled automatically, their radar systems tracking the approaching threats. But there was a problem. The hostile boats were weaving between fishing vessels and commercial traffic, using them as shields. The carrier's defensive systems couldn't fire without risking civilian casualties, and the terrorists knew it. This was a suicide run, carefully planned, and they'd found a gap in the carrier's defenses. On the flight deck, most personnel had moved to their battle stations below deck, clearing the exposed areas, but Marcus Tennant stood at the edge of the catwalk, binoculars pressed to his eyes, his body absolutely still despite the carrier beginning evasive maneuvers. Lieutenant Carver, now at his general quarters station in the tower, spotted Tennant through the windows and grabbed a phone. "What is that chief doing on the catwalk? Someone get him inside now." But before anyone could respond, Tennant moved. He pulled something from inside his float coat, something that caught the light as he raised it to his shoulder. Carver's blood went cold as he recognized the shape. It was a rifle, but not any rifle issued to standard carrier crew. It was a Mk-12 special purpose rifle, a weapon used exclusively by Special Operations Forces. Through the windows, Carver watched as Tennant dropped into a shooting stance that was absolutely textbook, his body settling into the kind of position that came from thousands of hours of training. The first shot cracked across the water at 11:47 a.m., barely audible over the carrier's engines but precisely aimed. Marcus Tennant's bullet crossed 830 meters in less than a second, passing between 2 fishing boats and striking the forward fuel tank of the lead hostile craft. The boat erupted in flames, veering off course as its pilot lost control. The explosion sent a pillar of black smoke into the sky, and suddenly the tactical picture changed completely. The remaining hostile boats broke formation, abandoning their careful concealment among civilian traffic and accelerating directly toward the carrier in a desperate final push. It was exactly what Tennant had calculated they would do. Now the phalanx systems had clear targets. The Gatling guns opened fire with a sound like tearing canvas, streams of tungsten rounds chewing through fiberglass and metal. 2 more boats disintegrated under the withering fire, but 3 were still coming, spreading out to create multiple targeting problems. Tennant's rifle spoke again, a measured rhythm that was almost meditative in its precision. Each shot was independent, calculated, perfect. He wasn't spraying rounds hoping for hits. He was making surgical strikes against specific components, engine blocks, fuel lines, steering mechanisms. His second target lost power and drifted, dead in the water. His third took a round through the pilot, slumping sideways. The FA-18s roared overhead at that moment, their pilots ready to engage, but they held fire as they watched the remaining threats being neutralized from the carrier itself. The Seahawk arrived seconds later, its door gunners adding their fire to the defensive barrage. Within 90 seconds of Tennant's first shot, the threat was over. 5 hostile boats destroyed or disabled, the 6th turning away at high speed, apparently losing its nerve when the attack fell apart. The Combat Information Center erupted in controlled cheers, but Commander Vickers was already moving, heading for the flight deck at a run. She needed answers, needed to know what the hell had just happened. On the catwalk, Marcus Tennant calmly field-stripped the rifle, securing it back in its concealed case, his hands steady despite having just killed at least 3 people and saved potentially hundreds. Lieutenant Carver reached him first, breathless from sprinting down 6 levels of ladders. "Chief Tennant, who the hell are you?" Marcus Tennant turned slowly to face the gathering crowd of officers and senior enlisted who had followed Carver to the catwalk. His weathered face was calm, almost serene, as he reached up and unzipped his float coat. Beneath it, his uniform shirt carried decorations that made everyone go silent. A SEAL Trident gleamed on his chest, the golden eagle clutching an anchor, trident and pistol that marked him as one of the most elite warriors in the American military. But it wasn't just the trident. Above it was a silver star. Below it were campaign ribbons from Iraq, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, places that most of the gathering sailors had only seen on news reports. Commander Vickers pushed through the crowd, her eyes widening as she took in Tennant's decorations. "Senior Chief Tennant," she said quietly, using his proper rank for the first time, "would you care to explain why a Navy SEAL is working catapults on my flight deck?" Tennant met her gaze steadily. "I volunteered for this assignment 6 months ago, ma'am. Intelligence indicated a heightened threat environment for carrier operations in this region. Previous attacks have exploited gaps in our close-in defense protocols. I requested permission to embed as regular crew to assess vulnerabilities and provide enhanced security without alerting potential hostiles to our improved capabilities. Vickers processed this, her tactical mind immediately grasping the implications. You've been running reconnaissance on our own ship, with full authorization from NavSpec and your captain. Yes, ma'am. The terrorists don't know about me because I'm not on any roster that could be compromised. I'm just another old chief working the deck, or I was. The gathered sailors were stunned into silence, their image of old-timer completely shattered. Airman Rossiter pushed forward, his young face full of questions. But sir, the limp, the slow movement, acting like you could barely keep up, was that all fake? Tennant smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him. Mostly. I actually do have some arthritis in my left knee from a bad jump into Kandahar in 2009, but I may have exaggerated it a bit for operational security. Lieutenant Carver felt his face burning as he remembered every conversation where he'd treated Tennant like a liability, every time he'd suggested the chief transfer to easier duty. I tried to reassign you. The debrief took 3 hours and involved secure communications with NavSpec War Command, the strike group admiral, and intelligence assets across the region. Marcus Tennant, now properly identified as Senior Chief Marcus Tennant, SEAL Team 5, sat calmly through it all, providing detailed reports on the attack patterns, weapons systems and tactical approaches used by the hostile forces. His observations from 6 months of seemingly mundane deck duty had created a comprehensive intelligence picture that would reshape carrier defense protocols across the fleet. The suicide boats had been part of a larger network that had been watching carrier operations for months, looking for the right moment to strike. They'd chosen today because the flight schedule had the deck at maximum activity, assuming the chaos would provide cover for their approach. What they couldn't have known was that an operator with 2 decades of special operations experience had been watching them just as carefully, noting their reconnaissance patterns, identifying their staging areas, and waiting for them to make their move. As the sun set over the Arabian Sea, casting the carrier deck in orange and gold light, Tennant walked one final time across the non-skid surface he'd called home for half a year. Tomorrow he would transfer to a fast frigate and head back to his team, his mission complete. But tonight, he wanted to say goodbye to the sailors he'd worked alongside, the young men and women who'd called him old-timer and never suspected the truth. Airman Rossiter found him near Catapult 3, standing where he'd worked nearly every day. Senior Chief, can I ask you something? Tennant nodded. That day you grabbed me, saved me from getting hit by that Hornet. You weren't just lucky, were you? You knew it was coming before anyone else did. Tennant put a hand on the young sailor's shoulder. 347 combat missions teach you to see patterns, to notice small things before they become big problems. That pilot had been drifting 6 inches left all morning. I knew he was going to keep drifting. You were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Rossiter shook his head in wonder. We had no idea who you really were. Tennant smiled. That was the point. The best protection is the kind nobody knows about until they need it. You all did your jobs perfectly today. Remember that. As Tennant walked toward the island for the last time, sailors lined up along his path, not quite standing at attention but showing respect in a dozen small ways. The man they'd called old-timer had turned out to be one of the most dangerous operators in the Navy, and he'd spent 6 months protecting them while they never even knew his name.